Have you ever wondered why some people feel nothing when a fantasy world opens its gates? No wonder, no thrill, just a quiet disconnect, like their mind refuses the invitation. Whether you've felt this way yourself, or you know someone who treats enchanted creatures, ancient kingdoms, or shifting realities like visual static, you're not alone. The psychology of people who hate fantasy is far deeper than not liking imagination. The way you react to these stories may reveal how your mind protects itself, grounds itself, and interprets meaning. Because for some people, stepping into a fantasy world doesn't feel like escape. It feels like losing the ground beneath them. For fantasy-resistant minds, discomfort begins the moment a story steps outside the boundaries of everyday logic. A normal scene suddenly shifts into enchanted creatures, ancient kingdoms, or rules that rewrite themselves, and instead of feeling intrigued, their mind tightens. This reaction comes from a psychological trait known as reality anchoring, a built-in preference for environments where cause and effect remain stable. It isn't a lack of imagination. It's a reliance on predictability to stay emotionally centered. When a world abandons real-world structure, it can feel destabilizing rather than freeing. If fantasy has ever made you feel disconnected instead of absorbed, your mind may simply be defending the structure it trusts. For people who dislike fantasy, the issue often goes beyond plot or setting. It's emotional. Fantasy worlds ask the viewer to release their grip on familiar emotional patterns, to feel awe instead of certainty, wonder instead of stability. But some minds stay regulated through emotional grounding, a trait that favors steady, recognizable feelings over exaggerated or symbolic ones. In fantasy, emotions behave differently. Love becomes destiny, fear becomes prophecy, grief becomes a world-ending force. To someone who relies on grounded emotions, this heightened symbolism can feel overwhelming or even artificial. Their reaction isn't resistance to imagination, it's a desire for emotions that stay within human proportions. For many individuals, the challenge with fantasy isn't the creatures or the world building, it's identity. Everyone develops an internal sense of what feels like them and what doesn't. This is shaped by a trait psychologists call identity boundaries, the invisible line between what fits me and what doesn't belong to my world. Fantasy often crosses that line. It asks people to imagine themselves in roles, environments, or emotional extremes that simply don't match their internal style. Instead of expanding their identity, it can feel like stepping into someone else's costume. Which explains why some people react when invited into fantasy with the same energy they use when someone says, "Come on, just try LARPing once." Suddenly, they remember urgent things to do, like reorganizing their socks. Their avoidance isn't stubbornness, it just doesn't align with the self they trust. Fantasy often introduces complex systems, new rules, unfamiliar terms, entire histories compressed into a few scenes. For some people, this triggers a trait called cognitive load sensitivity, which describes how easily the mind becomes overwhelmed when too much new information arrives at once. In realistic stories, the world is already understood, but in fantasy, the viewer must mentally assemble a new reality from scratch. Names, maps, lore, kingdoms, everything requires active processing. For some minds, that effort doesn't feel immersive. It feels like homework wearing a cape. This isn't about intelligence. It's about mental economy. Some people simply prefer stories that don't require a second brain to keep track of who belongs to which ancient order. When the mental cost outweighs the emotional payoff, fantasy stops feeling like entertainment. People who struggle to enjoy fantasy often react to something deeper than dragons or world building. Their discomfort usually ties back to a trait called control orientation. the preference for worlds where events follow stable rules and predictable logic. Fantasy rarely offers that. A character can alter destiny, reality can bend without warning, and entire plot lines can hinge on forces that ignore cause and effect. For someone who relies on consistent structure, this kind of unpredictability doesn't feel magical. It feels destabilizing. Their mind relaxes when the world behaves reliably. Freud might say their ego prefers a universe where consequences make sense, not one where reality twists itself for dramatic flair. It's not imagination they resist, it's the collapse of structure. Fantasy offers endless worlds and limitless possibilities, a chance to step outside the boundaries of reality. But not everyone feels drawn to that door. Some feel grounded in the familiar, anchored in logic, and reassured when stories stay within the emotional patterns they understand. So, where do you fall? Are you someone who loses yourself in imaginary worlds? Or someone who feels more at home with your feet firmly in reality? Interestingly, many traits found in fantasy-resistant minds overlap with those who dislike trends, a preference for stability, coherence, and authenticity over shifting worlds, fictional or fashionable. If you want to explore that parallel more deeply, the video on trend resistance breaks it down in detail. Fantasy frees some minds. Others find clarity in the real world,